Sometimes even the darkest cloud can have a silver lining. And sometimes it takes a while for people to figure out just what that silver lining is. In the summer of 1921, Franklin Roosevelt was an up-and-coming, one of the most up-and-coming politicians in the Democratic Party. He had been nominated for vice president in the previous year, in 1920. The ticket, with James Cox at the top, had gone down to defeat, but that was no big surprise. It looked to be a Republican year. And it's generally the rule in American politics that if a ticket loses the presidential race, the blame doesn't fall on the vice presidential nominee. The blame is taken by the presidential nominee, and very often the vice presidential nominee can come out looking pretty good because to this point, they're nearly all, to this point in 1920, they were all men. He advanced to the second place in his party's estimation, and so since the top person failed, then he might be next in line to get the party's presidential nomination the next time around. And in fact, that's exactly what people thought about the results of the 1920 election. The Democrats lost. It was a bad defeat, but it was a Republican year. And so Franklin Roosevelt, who conducted himself quite well as the VP candidate, was being talked about as the obvious choice when the Democrats met in 1924 to choose their presidential nominee the next time around. Franklin Roosevelt was something of a golden boy. He had a famous name, his uncle by marriage and his fifth cousin by birth. Theodore Roosevelt, of course, had been president of the United States, and Roosevelt, Roosevelt. So anyway, so things are looking really good for Franklin Roosevelt. He joins his family for a summer vacation at their home in Campobello Island off the coast of Maine. And he did the stuff that he did. He was a relatively young father, 39 years old. He has several children. And he leads the children on the outdoor activities that day that he usually did. So they went on a long hike. They went on a swim. They built a campfire. They did this and that. And toward the end of the day, he was a little bit surprised. He felt more tired than usual. He was a very athletic guy, and he had always been known for having tons of energy. But on this day, he was feeling really fatigued at the end of the day. He thought, well, okay, I probably just caught a chill, swimming in the cold water, and then as the sun went down and so things got cool, I got a chill. He thought it would probably be a cold. So he went to bed. He skipped dinner that night, which was unusual. He appreciated the family dinners, but he skipped dinner and went to bed. And he woke up the next day unable to move his arms or his legs. And for anybody, this would have been a shock. And for someone as active as Franklin Roosevelt, it was really a shock. And he didn't know what had come over him. A doctor was called, and the doctor came in and examined the patient, asked him some questions, and concluded that Franklin Roosevelt had come down with polio. Polio, in those days, was often called infantile paralysis. This because polio was a pretty common disease among young children. And it often manifested itself as a form of paralysis. Sometimes it was just a numbness in legs in particular, sometimes in the arms. Sometimes the individuals were actually paralyzed. Now, it was often the case that young people would make a pretty good recovery. In some cases, not a complete recovery. And there were lots of people in Franklin Roosevelt's day who, as children, had contracted polio and forever after walked with a limp, or there was just some lingering effect of this. Polio was one of the reasons that the Roosevelt family had a home on the coast, because it was understood, although people didn't know exactly what caused polio and how it was transmitted, but they could put two and two together and realize that polio, first of all, was more frequent during the summer than during the winter, and it was more commonly contracted if you were in cities than if you were away from the cities. Now, this is generally the case for diseases that are spread by infection, infectious diseases. You have to be around people who have or have had the infection in order to contract it. And so if you get away, this is one of the reasons that people, especially rich folks who could afford it, would have summer homes. And the summer homes would be at the beach or in the mountains, or where there weren't so many people around. So Franklin Roosevelt had polio. Now, it was unusual for polio to strike adults, hence the name infantile paralysis. But when it did strike adults, it was often much more severe. It could be devastatingly severe, and it certainly seemed to be devastating and devastatingly severe in the case of Franklin Roosevelt, because his entire body below his neck was paralyzed. And he didn't know what this meant, didn't know what was going to happen to him. It was the case that people afflicted with polio often showed the most severe symptoms right away. And then there was some improvement. The improvement could vary from a little to complete improvement. So Franklin Roosevelt found himself, this guy who the day before had been running around like a kid, and with all the energy in the world and doing this, that, and the other thing, he couldn't move. Now, the first thing that happened to him was, well, not surprisingly, he was cast into a deep depression. And, as far as he could tell, his life had ended. Yes, he was still alive, but all the things that he was hoping for seemed now to be out of reach. In Franklin Roosevelt's day, the early 1920s, people who had disabilities, very often, if they were wealthy, they didn't get out in public much. It was seen as kind of embarrassing to the person who had the disability, and maybe even embarrassing to other people to have to see them. There was a term in those days for people who had disabilities like this. They were called cripples. And cripples made people uncomfortable. Franklin Roosevelt could not point to anyone that he knew who had been really successful in life, whether in professions or in politics, who was, and he would have used the term, who was a cripple. And so Franklin Roosevelt thought, oh my gosh, my political career is over. I'm going to be expected to stay home, and for that matter, I think I probably ought to stay home. The family had enough wealth that he didn't have to work, and so he could just become a gentleman of leisure, and it would be enforced leisure because what's he going to do? He's paralyzed. So all of a sudden, his bright hopes, his ambitions, seem to have just disintegrated. And he's probably going to be stuck in a sickbed for the rest of his life. And at this point, he's sort of hoping the rest of his life isn't too long, because what is left to live for? So Roosevelt is in this depression, and he can't see any reason to want to keep living. Now, there was an initial period of recovery. So initially, he couldn't use his arms. He had no feeling in his arms, couldn't move his arms. In the course of the next few weeks, he gradually regained the use of his arms. But he never regained the use of his legs, despite all of the effort he put into rehabilitation. Now, once he regained the use of his arms, then he was fitted out with a wheelchair. And wheelchairs, at least the ones that Franklin Roosevelt preferred, didn't look like the wheelchairs you see today, the stainless steel things that are custom built for that purpose. Typically, what somebody would do is take a regular chair, a desk chair or something like that, a fairly straight back chair, and put some wheels on it. And then put some handles where people could roll them around. And at least he's no longer flat on his back. At least now he can sit up. And he can get around with assistance. But Roosevelt wasn't willing to settle for that. He knew that people did recover. Maybe not entirely, and especially people who contracted polio as adults. They tended to have less chance of recovery. By the way, Roosevelt probably didn't realize this, but there's every reason to think that it was Franklin Roosevelt's very privileged upbringing that led to his contracting such a severe case of polio. It seems to be the case, and this is true of many infectious diseases, if you get them as a child, the symptoms aren't so severe, and the recovery is usually more rapid and greater. Now, Franklin Roosevelt wasn't an ordinary child. He didn't have an ordinary childhood. He was from a wealthy family. He didn't go to regular school. So parents of young children know that very often their kids are healthy, little toddlers are healthy, until they go off to preschool, or they go off to kindergarten, or they go to some sort of situation where they're mingling with other kids. Because when they're on their own, they don't catch the various bugs that go around. As soon as they start going to school, they start getting them. But what happens when they get them is they develop resistance to these ordinary diseases. And so their body develops a robust immune system. Franklin Roosevelt, and certainly other wealthy, privileged children, didn't have that experience, precisely because he was so privileged and protected. He didn't develop the robust immune system that ordinary kids who were playing in the dirt and rolling around with all the other kids who had all the diseases of the day, that they would get. So the fact is that he apparently was not exposed to polio, which is a waterborne virus, that he wasn't exposed to it until he was 39 years old. And he probably contracted it at a Boy Scout camp. He was a supporter of the Boy Scouts, and he had gone to this camp to give a speech and to shake hands and do all the stuff that politicians do. And probably while he was there, that's when he contracted the polio virus. And he came down with the symptoms some days later. And because he didn't have any resistance from childhood, it knocked him literally flat on his back. He did improve, however, though, at least at first, and he regained the use of his arms. But he believed that he could regain use of his legs. This was his goal. He devoted himself to a stern regimen of physical therapy. The first thing he did was to get himself fitted with braces for his legs. He couldn't move his legs on their own, but he could lock his knees into place with these heavy steel braces that would anchor themselves on his lower leg and against his upper leg. And so his knees wouldn't collapse. And with the use of canes, in particular the canes that kind of slip over your forearms so they give you extra bracing, he could kind of walk. Basically what he would do is he would swing his whole right leg forward And although there wasn't any feeling in it, he could, with sort of twisting his hips, he could swing his right leg forward. And then he'd plant his right leg on its brace. And then he would swing his left leg forward. And his arms would keep him from falling over. His legs were no good for balance, but with the canes, he could keep himself up. And his goal was to be able to make the quarter-mile walk from the family home in Hyde Park, New York, to the end of the driveway where the mailbox is on the highway there. And he wanted to be able to go out and check the mail. And so he would see how far he could get. And one day he would get 50 yards before he became exhausted, or sometimes before he fell, because he would fall on occasion. He needed somebody to help him get back up again. And maybe the next day he'd go 60 or 70 yards. And the next day he'd go 100 yards. And so he could get maybe halfway down that long driveway. But he never quite made it to the end. He never quite got that far. He realized that there were limitations on his recovery. He took up swimming. He had learned to swim as a kid, but he really became a swimmer with a vengeance now and with a purpose. And the purpose was to build the strength in his arms and shoulders, his upper body strength, because this is what was going to move him around. His arms and shoulders were his means of locomotion now. And he had a swimming pool built at his home. Now, this is upstate New York, though, and the swimming season isn't year-round by any means. And so he also started making time to spend at a health resort, a spa in Warm Springs, Georgia. And he would spend weeks and months there. And this was called Warm Springs because there was warm water coming out of the springs, and there were pools that were thought to have curative effects. Partly because they were warm, and partly because the warm water dissolved various minerals in them, and the minerals somehow were good for the sufferers. At least they certainly felt good. But perhaps the most positive effect that Roosevelt got from the warm water was when he was swimming, he could, for a moment, forget that he was paralyzed from the waist down. Because in the water, his body was weightless. His legs didn't have to support him. And as he built up his arm strength, he could become a very good swimmer. Not an Olympic swimmer by any means, but he could really move up and down the pool. And between the feeling that the water gave him and the exercise that it gave him overall, he just loved Warm Springs. And he loved the therapy. He also loved the fact that he was surrounded by people who were suffering similar maladies. Some of them were actually polio victims, and others had other maladies. And there was sort of this health colony there at Warm Springs. Roosevelt benefited enormously from the fact that there was family money. So he could afford to spend long periods of time away from home in Georgia. He could afford to have an automobile fitted out so that he could drive it just using his hands. And so instead of the accelerator being moved by his foot, he had an accelerator that his hand could control. And so when he would drive in his car, to all the world, he would look pretty normal. In fact, he would look really healthy because from the waist up, Roosevelt probably be put on 15, 20, 25 pounds of muscle. So he looked like this real, healthy, muscular specimen. And he used to drive this car around the grounds at the family home in Hyde Park, New York, and he would drive the car around Warm Springs in Georgia. And Roosevelt, he had that characteristic political personality where he loved to press the flesh, to shake hands with people. And of course, he could still shake hands with people. And he could talk to people. And he got to know people in the rural South, people that he never would have gotten to know before, people that he never would have met. And these were farmers, for the most part, who were very often poor. It was not a particularly fertile region of the South, and the farmers often had a hard time, making ends meet. But they were friendly. They liked this guy, this outsider, this Yankee, this New Yorker that they had met, and he seemed like a good guy. And there was kind of a bridging of the cultural divide between the two. So Roosevelt got to understand them, their concerns. Life was tough in the farm sector in the 1920s. Farm prices were low, and people who didn't have the best and most efficient operations, and even some of those, were suffering. And so Roosevelt could see what they were suffering. He could see the problems that these ordinary folks had. And these ordinary folks could see Roosevelt. And they could see something that they probably kind of knew intellectually, but now they experienced it emotionally, that being rich doesn't protect you from all of life's harms. And so here's this guy, he had all the money. He didn't have all the money in the world, but he had enough money, but he couldn't even stand on his own. He couldn't even walk. And so there was a kind of connection that was made between Roosevelt and these ordinary folks. Now, all this while, Roosevelt is hoping that he's going to make further recovery, that one day he's going to be able to walk again. He gets better at walking. He's able to walk with his odd kind of hip-swinging gait. He enlists helpers, including his adult sons, big strapping young men, and typically he'd hold the arm of one of them and have a cane in the other one, and then he could get along okay. He tried getting out in public in some of his old circles. He had an office in downtown New York, and he went into the office one day, and he tried to go into the office, and he had in his mind, he had laid out, okay, this is how this is going to happen, because he had to think about, and more than one would today, he had to think about, okay, so what kind of barriers does someone encounter who can't walk? And he didn't want to be seen in public in a wheelchair. And this was really important to him. In fact, it was so important that he refused to let anybody take a photograph of him in a wheelchair. Some years ago, I wrote a book on Franklin Roosevelt, and I was doing research for my book at the Franklin Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, New York. And they have, among the documents and all the other stuff, they have photographs. And there are probably, 10,000 photographs at that library. And I didn't go through all 10,000, but I went through a lot of them. And I consulted with the archivists. And they had concluded that of the 10,000 photographs, there are only 2 that show Roosevelt in a wheelchair. And so you can tell that Roosevelt did not want the world to know that he couldn't walk. Now, it was no secret that Roosevelt had contracted polio. Roosevelt was this national figure. In 1920, he ran for vice president. And when the news broke, the family, Roosevelt included, tried to keep secret that he had contracted polio the following year, but the word got out. And so it made headlines all around the country because this was something that a lot of people worried about. There was no vaccine yet against polio. And so parents worried for their kids, and people worried for themselves that they might get polio. And so here is the most famous people in America who's got polio. But they heard that he got polio, and then he sort of slipped out of public view. Now, he slipped out of public view because he had polio, because he was focusing on his recovery, but also because it looked as though his political career was over. He didn't know of any politicians who campaigned in wheelchairs. This is one of the reasons that he insisted on not using a wheelchair, at least not in public. And so it would take decades until the Americans with Disabilities Act in the 1990s to really make clear that people with disabilities of various kinds ought to be accommodated in the public world. In Roosevelt's day, no. And so on this day that he was going into his New York office, he thought about, okay, how am I going to get to the office and all of this? And how am I going to negotiate getting from the car? When he's in the car, he's okay. But how am I going to get from the car to the office? And he thought through everything except the fact that the floor of the lobby in the office building, was made of marble. And the marble, especially after it had been cleaned and polished and waxed, was slick. And he saw this as he came in. He thought this might be a problem. In fact, it turned out to be a problem because the tips of his canes slipped on the marble floor, and he fell flat on his face. It was very embarrassing. Now, Roosevelt was a good actor. He could cover up his embarrassment, and he just smiled and tried to laugh it off. But he was quickly picked up by his driver and their helper there, and he got back in the car and went home, and he never tried that again. And this taught Roosevelt a lesson. Don't go out in public unless somehow you can control the venue. But it also contributed to his decision to drop out of politics, because he just could not imagine that he had a political career as, well, to use the term of the day, a cripple, as somebody who was disabled. Because people, Americans, they like to think of their president as a source of strength, someone that they can figuratively lean on. But Roosevelt was the one who had to be leaning on other people. Would anybody vote for such a person? It was really doubtful. And so Roosevelt began to think, okay, forget the political career, I'll have to come up with something. And again, it wasn't a pressing issue because he didn't need the income. There was family money. And he was seriously thinking, okay, my political career is over, I'm just going to drop out. And he might have, if not for his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt would become one of the most politically astute women in America. In fact, even until today, partway through the 21st century, Eleanor Roosevelt remains the most powerful, the most influential woman in American political history. If Hillary Clinton had been elected president in 2016, then Hillary Clinton would have become that person. And the first time there's a woman president, then, okay, that woman will take the honors away from Eleanor Roosevelt. But we haven't had a woman president yet. And Eleanor Roosevelt, turns out, would become almost an assistant president when her husband became president. But Eleanor Roosevelt was one who had political instincts from the time she was young. She was the niece by birth to Theodore Roosevelt. She had grown up with Theodore Roosevelt as a surrogate father when her own father had died. So politics was in the family. Oh, I should point out that Eleanor Roosevelt was Eleanor Roosevelt before she married Franklin Roosevelt, because she was a Roosevelt by birth. And so when she married Franklin Roosevelt, she became Eleanor Roosevelt Roosevelt. And the person who gave her away, this old traditional version, typically the father hands his daughter over to the groom and says, okay, basically, now you take care of her. Her own father was dead. And so Theodore Roosevelt, who at that time was President of the United States, gave Eleanor away to Franklin. And in doing so, he said, well, congratulations, Frank, and there's nothing like keeping the name in the family. Eleanor Roosevelt becomes Eleanor Roosevelt Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt refused to let her husband give up on a political career. Eleanor Roosevelt believed that her husband, Franklin Roosevelt, still had a political future. She was willing to go along with his backing away from politics for a while, which turned out to be the silver lining of Franklin Roosevelt's polio. And the silver lining was that if Franklin Roosevelt had been healthy, if he had never contracted polio, he very likely would have received the Democratic nomination for president in 1924, or if not in 1924, in 1928. Now those happened to be, as it turned out, Republican years. And Franklin Roosevelt then would have received the blame for the Democratic defeat in 1924 or 1928, and he probably would have never had another chance. And so the fact that Franklin Roosevelt was out of politics, taken out of politics for about 6 years by polio, meant that when he finally made his comeback under the encouragement of Eleanor, the tables had turned. And when he ran for president in 1932, it was a Democratic year. And Franklin Roosevelt became the Democratic President of the United States.